So after the big balance update, which factions are looking to be strongest in Warhammer 40k going forward? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd talk about which factions in the game are perhaps looking like some of the strongest after the points update, what reasons we have that they might do well from now on, and what their strong options might be going forward. Trying to work out which armies are strongest now is always interesting to speculate on after a balance update. I maybe touched upon it a little bit in previous videos, though not really as the central thing, more focusing on how armies have either gained or lost. I feel like for the past balance updates, they did broadly quite a good job of making this a little bit less obvious. There weren't really any cases of top factions getting untouched or getting better, at least not for the ones that both had win rates in the very high percentages, around about 55 to 57. For armies like Sisters, Thousand Sons, Drukhari and Space Wolves, all of those got fairly solid nerfs, and beyond that there were quite a lot of individual units that were maybe propelling their factions to excessive amounts of tournament victories that also got toned down. Maybe units like Chaos Accursed Cultists, Guard Bullgrin or Deathwing Knights. For this video I thought it could be interesting to talk through a few of the factions that are looking really quite strong in 40k going forward. Going by previous numbers and the changes that they had, I thought I'd talk through 4 main ones and then 6 more honourable mentions. Though of course at this point all this is very highly speculative. 40k is fairly finely balanced at the moment, where small things can have quite a big impact, and there's all sorts of added complexity as to being stronger in a more casual or competitive setting, and depending on whether you're talking about, say, tournament win rates for the average player, or the factions that can win big tournaments around, in the hands of someone who knows their army perfectly. I still say it looks like we're broadly in a place where the 40k player skill and list building is going to be a bigger factor than the faction selection, which definitely seems like a nice to have for me. And it'll certainly be interesting to see how initial reactions match up with reality once we get a little bit of data as to what's really doing well. Starting out with some of the factions that are looking strongest, I feel like from people's general reactions after the updates, the Astra Militarum are looking rather strong. They were doing pretty fine before, and despite one big nerf, they've still got loads of viable options. For their tournament win stats, they were on around about 51% wins over the first balance update, though this had been trending upwards over the last few weeks. I wouldn't be too surprised if the introduction of Tempestus Aquilons might have been something to do with that. Getting 90 points for a 3-inch drop deep strike unit that you could potentially recycle with reinforcements if you wanted to is just really big. Basically guarantees that you can do certain secondaries and also dealing some precision damage to some units that need it. Beyond that, they've certainly been performing at a top level. 14 big event wins in Pariah Nexus, which is one of the highest around, and people have been putting them on the table in competitive play in good numbers, often being around about the 3rd to 5th most played army out of the 26 factions. Broadly speaking, I'd say they were doing really quite well before, and then the balanced updates gave them one big nerf and a few small buffs. The big nerf was to the Bullgrins, which is definitely a massively relevant one for them. A lot of the armies that have been winning grand tournaments were absolutely spamming them. Plenty of slightly odd looking lists that had no less than 18 Bullgrin in them, marching up the board to beat down the enemy in the midfield, maybe supported by move from Lord Solar Leontus occasionally when they needed it. They went up from 90 to 110 points, so a big 22% points increase there, and that is pretty massive. But I feel like compared with a bunch of other factions, Guard weren't really entirely dependent on them just for strength alone, and they've got quite a lot of options and good things to fall back on. For their other changes, the tank commanders went up 20 points, but I'd say that's probably outweighed by getting the squadron keyword on them. It means you'll have lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, and you can order yourself so you don't need to have the inefficiency of taking 2 different tanks along. I feel like the points increase maybe makes it a little bit more of a side grade as opposed to a flat upgrade though. The Scout Sentinels dropping down 5 points was kind of weird, but certainly a direct strength boost, seeing as they were already great at 60 points. Then I feel like Ogrin kind of go from usable to looking fairly strong at 60 points, and Field Ordnance Batteries are kind of okay efficiency, indirect at 100 points for their profile. Not going to be very universally general purpose, but solid enough damage into certain things. Overall though, it just generally looks like Guard were doing really quite well prior to the update. I feel like they've got enough interesting options in their codex to weather the loss of Bullgrin, particularly with the new Tempestus Aquilons around, likely having Lord Solar commanding things at the back still. Some combination of things like Hellhounds, Kaschan, Chimeras, Rough Riders, Ogrins and Deathcore of Krieg to scrap for the midfield more so than Bullgrin. Dawn's Rusters and Tank Commanders for some nice direct fire, lightly guided by some Sentinels. I wouldn't be too surprised if Guard wind up being one of the scarier options to play against for a while. Before we move on, I thought I'd just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold. One option for getting your miniatures from A to B in safety, with their purpose-built magnetic carry cases. They've currently got a Halloween sale on for up to 30% off their range. As part of their global sales launch, they're based in the US but only recently started shipping to other places around the world. These guys make magnetic carry cases. The idea is that it's an MDF box that you need to do a basic bit of assembly for. And then inside you have multiple trays worth of steel sheets that you can slot in at different levels. You mount magnets to the bases of your models, and then that stops them sliding around at all while they're being transported, so you can have really quite a lot of things all in one space together without needing padding with foam or anything like that. It has been a bit of a fashionable way to do things in more recent miniature transports. You certainly can DIY your own magnetic cases as well, which is another valid option, though they seem to have been popular enough for people who want something purpose-built. They can be a little bit heavy due to the MDF construction, but it does mean the boxes are very sturdy indeed, and I quite like the advantage of having the acrylic sheet on the front, so you can basically display and see your miniatures at the same time as transport them. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and I'll also cycle back to talk through the range of boxes and their prices at the end of the video. Getting back to armies that are looking super strong post-update though, next up we have the Genestealer Cults, pulling off a bit of a sneaky uprising after a very disappointing launch of their codex. Lots of players basically abandoned the faction when they received quite a lot of painful nerfs and were considerably harder to play. But a good few weeks after the last update, Games Workshop actually gave them a really quite massive and meaningful boost to Cult Ambush, allowing things to come back via pseudo Deep Strike, and that does seem to be all that they've needed for good players to start winning tournaments with them. Their overall win rates for the previous balance updates were a bit on the mid-side at around about 47%, but that's been going up to more like 51, 52 or so for the past few weeks after that update. And they're doing pretty well with a bunch of detachments besides the Brood Brothers, maybe the Outlander Claw doing the best. For top level play, it certainly looks like they're a contender. They had 4 biggish event wins during Pariah Nexus, which might not sound like much, but given the amount of rate of play they have, it's really not too bad. It was kind of notable that they seemed to have a lot of big placings last week, despite all those events that they did well in not using the new points. Basically, from where they were in competitive play at least, prior to the points update, they seem to be a pretty strong mid-tier faction that could certainly be strong in the right hands, even if they're a more hardened, less obvious army to play with. Then the balance update gave them some rather big buffs, both types of acolytes dropping down 5 points and neophytes dropping 5. And those changes would be a helpful enough boost to a whole load of lists that were already fairly good. Beyond that, the Primus went down to 80, which is quite nice for the whole general Neophyte Primus damage combo. And then they got further buffs to things like Jackals, which are nice for the Outlander, the Patriarch, which can be nice in the Biosantic Brood Surge, and the Benefactors, Jackal Alphas, Icon Ward, and small squads of Aberrants as well. It was quite a lot of things that got reduced, given that they seemingly had quite a bit of success before, and got a whole load of fairly broad, really quite nice boosts. Seems like they'll be in a good place to have even more success after this, particularly with a lot of the top tier factions getting some big nerfs. Lots of things seem pretty interesting and playable. Small units of acolytes were already fine for transports and objective work. Neophytes can do big damage combos with the Primus, and maybe there's a chance the Benefactors might get a look in at 70 points. Ridge Runners and Kellamorphs were both already great and in most lists. Transports had a big role in the Outlander Claw style list, and I guess maybe they might take a few more Jackals now. And Aberrants and Pure Strains and the cheaper Patriarch could certainly do some good work in Biosantic Brood Surge. Will be interesting to see how they perform with all that going forwards, but they still feel like they'll be a hard army to master, and they can have a fair bit of randomness with their Cult Ambush. Big units either coming straight back or refusing to turn up again just based on a 4+ or not. It sounds like there's going to be some more major changes for them in the not too distant future. GW said there'd be something changing about Cult Ambush in the December update. Next up, another army that's seeming fairly widely accepted to be looking quite good still are the Adepta Sororitas, despite the nerfs that they got. The Sisters were perhaps the single strongest army in the game prior to the update though, maybe rivaling with a couple of others. Very high win rates for the average player taking them to tournaments, around about the 56-57% kind of mark, and seemed also to have pretty much the best top level performance out of any faction, 20 big event wins, mostly using their Bringers of Flame. Games Workshop certainly came down fairly hard on their dominance. The auto include Triumph going up to 250 points, and then lots of other staple units that were in their cookie cutter Bringers of Flame list going up in their own way. Violent Paragons and Castigators and Immolators and Dominions and things, and big Seraphim squads also getting a big points increase as well. The Bringers of Flame enhancements also went up a bit. There were a couple of silver linings with Battle Sister squads and Zephyrim dropping down a bit. I could certainly see a few more Battle Sisters being used on the table now. Despite the nerfs, I still feel like there's at least a fair bit of optimism for them being one of the stronger factions in the game. The Violent Paragon warsuits didn't go up so much that they're significantly different in my opinion. Then you got something like a 6% points increase or so, and that still feels acceptable for a unit that can tear the heart out of the opponent's army in a turn if they get a good activation off. The Castigator still seems pretty strong at 160 points. I feel like the Sisters have got quite a lot of other units that they can pivot and fall back to. I guess Battle Sisters at the new lower price, maybe some Retributors in transports in place of Dominions, perhaps a little bit of melee like Arco-Flagellants, and maybe being tempted by a few Rhinos instead of Immolators. I'd guess the Triumph will see less play with that massive points increase, even if those Auto 6 Miracle dice are rather amazing. If you did drop the Triumph though, then that does mean that there's a lot more room for plenty of other stuff on the board. There still would have been 190 points that you could then convert into other scary damage dealer units if you wanted to, even if having the Great Synergy piece nerfed is definitely a blow to the faction. Exorcist might get a look in as well now that some of the other more traditional things have got nerfed. Quite a scary indirect fire platform that could do alright at high levels of play. They'll certainly be weaker than where they were before, though I feel like there's still a good chance that they'll be strong, given that they were one of the game's top factions, and they've got more options that they can just change to, as opposed to armies like Thousand Sons, where the vast majority of their good stuff went up and they don't have loads else in their index. As initial impressions, I feel like maybe those previous three are some of the ones that really stick out a little bit. If I had to pick one more to perhaps stand out a little bit from the crowd, I thought the Tyranids might be worth a shout. They got their great big redesign at the Pariah Nexus update, and since then they've been doing rather well. They were an army with around 51% win rates in tournaments, so one of the higher performing factions that didn't get a great big nerf with the balance update, mainly doing that with Invasion Fleet, Vanguard Onslaught and Synaptic Nexus. Their top tournament stats also look good for play at the higher levels. 10 big events won in Pariah Nexus, and that's still a solid performance if weighted per player, despite them being one of the most popular factions in tournament play rates. Autumn vying for most played army, perhaps not too surprising, given their recent popular with the Leviathan box set and lots of people wanting to make them work if they can. Given that they were already in a fairly good spot, the fact that they just didn't really get any major changes in the balance update is probably a good thing more than bad. They more got sort of internal balance kind of changes. Winged Hive Tyrant, the Von Rhein's Leapers and the Carnifex all went down. Old One-Eye, Lictors and Pyrovores and single units all went up a tiny bit. I don't really feel like any of those changes are really at the point where they change all that much about how you'd use the units though. As before, they still have a few strong ways to play. Exocrines with a Hive Tyrant are a bit of a staple, just general purpose lethal hits, firepower that can blast a whole bunch of things dead. The Tyrannifex is often seen lurking in the backfield with that Rupture Cannon to give enemy tanks a bad day and just be hard to kill as well. Moving forward, there's often Norna Emissaries, Maliceptors, perhaps Old One-Eye on Carnifexes, the Neurotyrant plus some Zonethropes for a dangerous firepower unit that gets big guns never tire is all very nice. They've got lots of good variants in Lone Operative between the Lictor types and the Neurolictor, and then different detachments can push you in different ways. Vanguard Onslaught, obviously making everything with a Vanguard Invader keyword far better, and Synaptic Nexus doubling down on the damage buffs and defense buffs for big synapse things, plus some help getting to melee. Overall, I'm not sure if Tyranids are going to be one of 40k's very top factions going forwards, but certainly feels like they could be in a good place to rise up further, given that they were doing kind of well and their biggest rivals got nerfed. Otherwise though, as mentioned, I feel like 40k is really quite finely balanced at the moment. There's loads of other armies that feel like they could either be just a tiny bit behind or maybe at the same sort of level as these. I'll run through these ones maybe a little bit more quickly. Dark Angels were absolutely top tier with their Gladius before. They got a 6% increase on Deathwing Knights. The Gladius nerfed with Fire Discipline Eradicators hit, and Azrael going up a tiny bit, but not to the point where it's not auto-include. If still wanting to run Gladius Dark Angels, Deathwing Knights still seem absolutely fine. I think that more people will be using the line at 285 points, and there might be a bigger focus on Inner Circle Companions versus Deathwing Knights, maybe shifting the balance in their favour a bit. I feel like Fire Discipline is still absolutely fine. I wonder if some people might start to discover Hellblasters as an interesting option for that. For the Blood Angels, they've got their new Codex. Previously they were winning around about 52%, but the Codex has changed things for better or worse. I'd say at first impressions it seems like they're at a similar sort of power level, which is broadly good news for them. Sanguinary Guard and Dante look all very nice. Death Company with Asterath and Lamartes both seem pretty savage still, even if you still can't have the Power Fist squads anymore, and the Liberator Assault Group got the Advance and Charge and the Fights First enhancement, and didn't really lose anything crazily key to it. Mephiston seems great as a lone operative, and Assault Intercessors plus Captains are still absolutely savage jumping out of impulsors and things. Death Guard looked like an army that got a very solid power boost. I would have rated them at maybe mid to even slightly lower mid tier before. Win rate's 48% with only 2 event wins over the previous weeks, but they just got a whole slew of very direct buffs to them. 110 point Death Shroud are just kind of ridiculously efficient for their damage and defense. A cheaper Biologist Putrefier won't hurt given that they were auto-include for Plague Marines. Cheaper Wardog Brigands was a unit that they got a lot of mileage out of already, and Mortarion at 300 points I feel like will now be cropping up in most lists for them. Again, not too sure about them being top tier. They feel like one of the armies that might be a bit more of a stat check type army, as opposed to massive amounts of room for crazy creative play. But I feel like just mass Death Shroud Terminators are going to be very hard to deal with for a whole bunch of players out there. Otherwise, Adeptus Mechanicus may fall into the same sort of area as perhaps Tyranids, a 51% win rate with a fair few big tournament victories despite a pretty tiny player base. I feel like unlike a few of the other mid-tier factions though, they got some really quite direct nerfs that directly impact their power build. 5-point increases on the Iron Striders, Taraxi and the Skitarii Vanguard I think were all unhelpful for their Hunter cohort, even if a few things went down. Still broadly feel like they're in a good place though, just maybe a bit more upper mid as opposed to outright best in the game at first impression. Grey Knights, again more on the same sort of level, win rates around about 51%, 6 big tournament victories, and unlike the Admech didn't get any nerfs. They got cheaper small squads of Terminators and a cheaper Purgation squad, maybe not the biggest buffs in the world, but not really unhelpful. Again, in the face of the strongest armies in the game getting nerfed across the board, in a good position to rise up. And then finally for Chaos Space Marines, the Accursed Cultists got heavily hit, but beyond that a lot of options went from sort of medium weak to fairly solid. And it wasn't like every single Chaos list that won a tournament was spamming Accursed Cultists. I suspect them to probably retain their spot with maybe a bit more of a middling win rate overall, but still be a faction that takes down an unusually large amount of grand tournaments. Beyond all those, I still feel like the majority of factions will be able to compete very solidly though. I feel like there's loads more that I could happily have mentioned. Thousand Sons still have some incredibly scary tools even if you'll have less of them. Necrons still have a bunch of strength with Catan and very scary Doomsday Arcs. And there were a whole bunch of other armies around about the 49%, 50% win rate mark that didn't really get nerfs and might be in a good position to rise up more in the face of nerfed competition. I still say that in current 40k it's not going to matter quite as much about individual faction strength, it's going to be a bit more important as to player skill and army list construction. It looks like the very first event with the new points were won by Ultramarines Vanguard and then Drukhari Real Space Raiders, and at first impressions I wouldn't guess either of those will be in the absolute top flight of 40k after the update, though I guess we'll wait and see. I'll certainly be looking forward to checking back on this when we've got a bit of interesting stats and tournament data. In any case, I'll certainly be interested in hearing what your guys' thoughts are. Which armies do you think will be strongest in Warhammer 40k after the update, and what sort of lists are going to be the ones to fear? As mentioned, for the end of the video I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor, Tabletop Stronghold, and their range of MDF magnetic carry cases with a bunch of pull-out steel trays inside them to be able to transport miniatures with magnets attached to the bases. Looking at the mag cases a little bit more closely, this is the rough capacity of the tray size. As you can see, there's room for really quite a lot of models here. You can fit on about 90 infantry with 25mm bases, around about 30 Terminators or so, and a good bunch of vehicles. Depending on the army and the organisation, you can fit really quite a lot into a small space. For the different sizes of these, first up we have the Mag Case Mini. This one's £70, $80 or €82 while it's on sale, down from the below price normally. That price includes shipping, which is free to much of the world, the UK, USA, Canada, the EU, and Australia and New Zealand. And they also come with a whole bunch of magnets to attach to the bases of your models as well, that they can be acquired fairly cheaply elsewhere too. For their more regular Army Mag Case offering, this is the more standard one. It's £105, $120 or €124 while on sale. This one's the one that's maybe a little bit more aimed at bigger army forces with some larger models included. You can see there's enough room for a Chaos Knight on the bottom shelf out of these three. So this one does have at least a fair amount of capacity. I'll leave the external and internal dimensions here on the screen. Then for really big armies there's the XL option as well. This one's essentially two of the previous attached together, so double the capacity there. If going for the same number of trays, it's a little bit cheaper than buying just two of the previous. This one's more like double the price though, as this option for it comes with extra magnetic shelves that you can have less if you prefer. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. If some fancy magnetic cases are of interest to you, then feel free to check them out, linked in the video description. They do have that sale on for Halloween at the moment. There's plenty of other good options for transporting miniatures of course, all sorts of foam cases out there, other custom built magnetic ones, and you certainly can DIY your own ones as well. So I feel like these ones will be the right choice for a bunch of people at least. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts on the strongest armies in new 40k. and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. If you've been enjoying videos on the channel and would like to support as well, I'd just like to mention that there's the channel's Patreon page linked below in the video description. There's a few fun things on that, including seeing certain videos early, occasional votes to see what sort of things come next, and automatic entry into the monthly prize giveaways, plus the channel's affiliate discount links for cheaper Warhammer, generally 10 to 20% off around the world, with affiliate links that support the channel. Feel free to check them out if you like, but otherwise just an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.